Okay, so for the people who are watching the recording, hello and welcome to Health in Europe. Today our panel discussion is entitled What Progress in Achieving Transparency in Pharmaceutical Regulation? And it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Katherine Fierlbeck of Dalhousie University, Emeritus Professor Joel Lexchin from York University in Canada, Dr. Jen Miller from Yale, and Dr. Kim Boesen of the Meta Research Innovation Center in Berlin. So I'm going to start by giving the floor to Professor Fierlbeck, who's going to talk a bit about a recent publication and project, and then we'll be giving the floor to Professor Lexchin, Dr. Miller, and Dr. Boesen. Okay, so over to Professor Fierlbeck. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. So today's panel stems from a workshop we had here in Nova Scotia almost exactly 3 years ago. And I can remember it well because it was the hottest day of the summer in a room with no air conditioning. But notwithstanding the rather tropical conditions, the discussion was very lively and very constructive. And it eventually resulted in this book, which was published this month by the University of Toronto Press. I'd like to thank the Jean Monnet Network for Health Law and Policy for funding this project, which was also supported by CIHR in Canada and by the McEachern Institute for Public Policy. Now, the questions we discussed at the workshop, which we refined in the book, were, given the regulatory changes made to the pharmaceutical sector in the past couple of decades, putatively to ensure greater accountability, how substantive have these changes actually been in practice? Have they really made much of a difference? And why have some jurisdictions been more successful than others in this respect? And what, if anything, can we learn from them? So Joel Lexchin, who will be speaking today on Canada's experience, is one of the original contributors to this volume. But in the spirit of the network, whose raison d'etre has been to try to bring together people from across as many jurisdictions as possible, we've also reached out to Jennifer Miller at Yale, who will speak to the American experience, and Kim Boesen in Berlin, who will discuss the European situation. So who knows, there might even be a volume 2. So back to you, Mary.
Okay, thank you, Professor Fierlbeck. Just as we give the floor to Professor Lexchin, I'll just be sharing his slides. If you just bear with me a moment, please. Sure. Okay, can I ask if you can see those?
I can. Could you put it in presentation mode, please?
Certainly. Okay, thank you, Professor Lexchin.
Yeah, it's still not in presentation mode. If you go down to the bottom of the screen, and
is that better?
no, you have to go down to the bottom with your cursor.
As far as I can see, it's
okay. There. Now, oops. No. There.
There. Okay, slideshow.
Yes.
Okay. I clicked on that. Yeah.
It didn't work, but we'll go ahead anyways. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what this title says, which I believe is accurate. The ways that Health Canada is failing in transparency. So next slide, please. Could you advance the slide? Thank you. So my conflict statement got passed over, but essentially I have no conflicts with any commercial entities. So there are three levels of transparency that we need to think about. So first, the rules that form the basis for regulation must be publicly available. Second, the data and information that are the results of regulations have to be released publicly. And finally, what I'm going to focus on is that the way that the government applies the regulations in reaching a final decision needs to be communicated effectively and publicly, and the efficacy of those communications need to be developed. In other words, how good is the government at actually telling people what's going on? So next slide, please. Slides aren't advancing. All right, so I'm going to go through the different stages of getting a drug onto the market, starting at the conduct of clinical trials, and then going all the way to how how Health Canada gets advice from outside experts. Next slide, please. So the first one is clinical trials. So in other words, before before the drug is marketed, how well does Canada communicate its the inspections, the results of the inspections that it does on the conduct of clinical trials? So Health Canada uses what are called risk-based criteria, but these are vague. The criteria that actually are used are vaguely described, and it amounts to how many subjects are enrolled and the number of trials at a specific location. So we really have no idea of how Health Canada makes its selections, and it only inspects about 2% of clinical trials that are ongoing in the country at any given time. Next slide, please. So when it does the clinical trials inspections, this is what shows up on its website. So you can see that it names the sponsor, where the part of the country where the clinical trial is being conducted, when the inspection was done, what drug it was, what phase, and then the rating of the inspection. In other words, whether or not it's been completed or whether it's ongoing. Next slide, please. However, if there are deficiencies in the way that the clinical trial is being run, the amount of information about those deficiencies is virtually non-existent. So this is what you get if there are a problem. Proposed corrective actions were requested and are pending. What corrective activities? We don't know. Pending, what does that mean? How long is it supposed to take? Are you going to reinspect after the corrective actions are done? We get none of that information. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on to the way that drugs are approved to see if they're eligible for marketing based on their efficacy and safety. So Health Canada uses a number of different pathways to get drugs on the market. One of them are priority reviews, which are used about 25% of the time. So in a paper that I did, priority reviews were used in about 30% of the drug applications, 159 over 509, but only 55 of those drugs were judged to be therapeutically innovative by outside evaluation. and the rationale behind the overuse of priority reviews was not communicated. Next slide, please. Another way of getting drugs onto the market faster is something called a notice of compliance with conditions, or otherwise referred to in other places as a conditional approval. And since the this program started in the late 1990s, it's been used over 100 times. 60 of these conditions have been fulfilled, but 45 as of now have not been fulfilled, some of them for more than 10 years, and there is no information that Health Canada gives about why the studies are delayed, how much progress is being made in them. Next slide, please. Drug approvals. This goes to one of the few success stories in transparency in Health Canada. But before we have success, we also have some failures. So Bill C-17 was designed to increase the level of transparency in terms of the release of clinical trial information. And before the bill was passed, it went through public consultations. Health Canada said, as a result of those consultations, all comments were considered, and the final guide incorporates changes to improve the clarity and precision of language to better reflect the legislative provisions. But there is no explanation of how those comments were incorporated, what changes were made. Next slide, please. This circular figure here is meant to convey information about the comments that Health Canada received on this on its consultations, but there's no indication from this pie chart about that some of the submissions were signed by multiple people. So if you look at academia, it looks like there were 13 separate people who may have made submissions from the academic sector, but in fact, at least one of those submissions was signed by over 100 people. So it grossly underrepresents the comments that Health Canada got. When Health Canada was advised about this, the only change that was made was a statement on the website that some submissions were signed by more than one person. So still an inadequate representation of the level of interest from the different communities. Next slide, please. As I said, this is one of the few areas where Health Canada has successfully increased its transparency, and as of February of 2019, it now releases complete clinical study reports. So it's the only regulator, along with the European Union, that does that. However, Health Canada still, sorry, not the European Union, the European Medicines Agency, but Health Canada still does not release reviewer reports, in other words, or any of the discussion that goes on amongst the reviewers as to the level, how confident they were about the information that the company provided. Next slide, please. Drug safety warnings. So what triggers Health Canada to send out a drug safety warning? And again, we're faced with a vague series of statements. The determination of the series of risk and urgency of the risk is based on sound scientific judgment. This effectively says nothing because we don't know what sound scientific judgment means, or if Health Canada takes actions on safety concerns, that all it says is the signal was evaluated and the appropriate benefit risk review of the information available was taken into consideration. Again, it tells us nothing about how Health Canada deals with safety warnings. Next slide, please. So there are no standards for once a safety warning has been issued. There are no standards for monitoring the effectiveness of the communication with either the public or healthcare professionals. Health Canada seems to think that all it needs to do is send out a safety warning, and that's sufficient. It doesn't look at whether or not that safety warning actually changes practice. Next slide, please. Once drugs are being made, Health Canada does inspections of the manufacturing facilities. But again, there's no information provided about corrective measures that need to be taken if problems are found at the manufacturing facilities. Next slide, please. When it comes to the promotion by companies, although the Food and Drugs Act and its regulations give the government the authority to take action on promotion, and it bans direct-to-consumer advertising, the regulation of promotion has effectively been turned over to either the industry or a private body. There have been no fines issued about on if promotion was found to be problematic since at least the mid-1970s. So that's over 40 years without Health Canada taking any direct action on promotion of prescription drugs. Next slide, please. And here you can see what Health Canada reports on its website about complaints it's received on drug promotion. The details of the alleged violation and corrective measures are virtually non-existent, continuing the pattern that we see with the results of inspections of clinical trials and manufacturing facilities. Next slide, please. Health Canada recognizes that it doesn't always have the expertise in-house to make all of the decisions necessary, so that it convenes committees and panels of outside experts. Next slide, please. When people are recruited onto the committees or panels, they have to declare or fill out a form about their conflicts, and they have a number of different categories about different kinds of conflicts that they may have, but these declarations are not made public. Next slide, please. I looked at this issue. There were record of proceedings available for 10 out of 30 meetings. The recommendations could have had a positive or negative effect on sales, but the votes of individuals on these committees were not recorded. Because their conflict statements were not released, there was no information about the types of interests that they had, the names of the companies that they were involved with, monetary values of the interests, and therefore it was not possible to link the interests to individual voting patterns. Next slide, please. So my bottom line is that back in 2004, the Canadian Association of Journalists deemed Health Canada the most secretive of all government departments and awarded it its Code of Silence for showing remarkable zeal in suppressing information and concealing vital data about dangerous drugs. And in my estimation, Health Canada is still deserving of this award. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions. And thank you, Mary, for doing the slides.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lexchin, for that fascinating overview of the situation in Canada. We pass now to Dr. Jennifer Miller, who's going to be talking about how things are working in the United States.
Great, thank you. Let me just pull up my presentation. Can you see my screen? Can you see the screen?
Not at the moment.
How about now?
Yes.
Great.
That's perfect.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in today's panel and talk about the importance of clinical trial transparency in our progress, at least within pharmaceutical industry-sponsored research. I'll be focusing my talk today on a project that I direct called the Good Pharma Scorecard. The Good Pharma Scorecard is an index that ranks pharmaceutical companies on their bioethics performance annually. It is designed to comprehensively address all of the key bioethics concerns we have about companies, but it is currently focused, at least publicly, on clinical trial transparency and data sharing practices. The project involves developing bioethics standards and accountability metrics that we can reasonably ask of companies, and then using those measures to evaluate and rank companies year after year to help catalyze change where needed and track industry progress on bioethics targets. It's currently focused on industry-sponsored clinical trials because industry is the largest sponsor of clinical trials for FDA-approved products. Some extra slides here. And we prioritize starting with clinical trial transparency in the Good Pharma Scorecard as opposed to other topics because of its importance for the quality of medical evidence and patient care and innovation, avoiding unnecessary duplicative research, and for honoring and protecting our research participants, among other reasons. Also, interestingly, a survey by Pew Research Center found that data sharing or open access to data is the #1 way to build trust and confidence in research findings and recommendations. And 57% of US adults say that they're more likely to trust scientific findings more if researchers make their data publicly available. So the new Good Pharma Scorecard rankings should be coming out in a couple of days. They were just accepted for publication, but they're still in proof stage. So I'll be sharing with you the 2019 rankings and then just some high-level results from the forthcoming rankings. So what you're seeing on the screen now are the drugs approved by the FDA in 2019 that were novel and sponsored by large pharmaceutical companies. We define large companies as the 20 largest companies by market cap. So there were 34 novel drugs approved by the FDA in 2015, 19 of which, or 56%, were sponsored by large companies based on a total of 628 trials involving over 154,000 trial participants, 92% of which were patients and 8% were healthy volunteers. So in the Good Pharma Scorecard, we evaluate 4 samples of trials. The first is we look at all of the trials that a company submits for FDA approval of a product. So we call that the all trials sample. And here you can see what we looked at is what percentage of those trials in an approved NDA, new drug application, were registered, had summary results reported in a registry like clinicaltrials.gov, although we review any public registry, what percent were published in the medical literature, and then what percent are publicly available, meaning either reported in clinicaltrials.gov or published in the literature. And what you find is that a median of 25 trials are conducted or at least submitted to the FDA in support of novel drug approvals, and 61% of those trials are registered within 6 months of FDA approval. So I should say that all these benchmarks are conducted at 6 months post FDA approval of the product. Only 33% of the trials in an approved NDA have summary results in a clinical trial registry, in a clinical trial registry. 31% are published. And then looking, a little bit more generously at reported or published, that number goes up to 55% of trials per drug are publicly available. On the drug level, only 11% of drugs have public results for all of their NDA trials. Narrowing the sample to just looking at trials conducted in patients for the approved indication, you'll see that that narrows the sample from 25 trials to a median of 13 trials per drug. There you'll see that a median of 100% of trials per drug are registered in a clinical trial registry, although about half of our drugs have an imperfect registration score. A median of 65% of trials conducted in patients for the approved indication have summary results reported in a registry, and only 45% are published. And then if you look at the publicly available piece, less than half of drugs have public results for their patient trials, 42%. Narrowing the sample even further, because legally companies are not required in the US to disclose the results of all of their trials. They're only, for this sample, required to follow a law passed in 2007 called FDAA, which was updated through the final rule. And here you can see that the sample of trials covered by the law shrinks again from 25 to 4. A median of 4 trials are subject to mandatory disclosures under US laws. And despite the narrowness, we still only get about 65% of drugs fully compliant with US trial registration and results reporting requirements. And interestingly, what you see on the screen too is that here in this sample, 2 drugs, you can't see it here, but often you'll find drugs that were approved by the FDA that weren't required to disclose any results under the law, because either all the trials were conducted outside of the US by a non-US based company, or for other reasons. Clinical trial transparency now means more than just registering your trials and reporting results. It means also sharing patient-level data. So we also look to see how companies are doing in committing to providing access to analysis-ready data sets and CSRs. And we look at look at their policies, that they have clear explanations on their website about how data can be requested, and that they publicly report the number of requests they get for data and the outcomes, essentially what percentage of those requests are granted and what percentage are denied. And then we ask that companies commit to sharing data by our deadline, which is either 6 months, within 6 months of FDA approval of the product, or 18 months after the trial completion date, whichever is later. So essentially we wanted to close the gap that a lot of companies have policies that say they'll only share data upon publication of trial results. But as you see, many trials remain unpublished. So we wanted to make sure that there wasn't a gap in data sharing as well. Here you can see that 25% of companies originally met our data sharing measures. We gave companies a 30-day amendment window to change their procedures to meet these measures. And about half of the low-scoring large companies took us up on this, raising the median score from 63% to 80% for the industry, and bumping up, adding one more company to full compliance with the measures. So then what we do is we provide an overall company ranking, which is a composite ranking of all of the measures I just explained to you, except the all trials measures. And so here you can see that only 2 companies fully disclose all their trials and patients for their approved products, commit to data sharing, and follow US trial registration results reporting requirements. And in our 2019 rankings, that was Roche and Novo Nordisk. To sort of create a race to the top, we emphasize a leaderboard, trying to get companies and their managers to say, like, why aren't we on the leaderboard? We need to do better. So in addition to ranking every company, we try and highlight the best practices as well. There's some good news that the percent of trials publicly available for the patient trial sample is going up year after year, and so are the median company scores, at least for the 3 first years of rankings. I can't tell you how the next set of rankings are looking, but stay tuned for a couple more days. And these transparency and data sharing rankings are becoming institutionalized across the sector, appearing in many companies, at least the highest scoring companies, annual reports and CEO letters and corporate responsibility reports. So now the question is sort of like, what do we do next, since there seems to be some preliminary data showing impact of the scorecard. And what we're doing is building out the scorecard to address equity concerns about biomedical research. And I won't talk about the equity measures, but I will talk about one of them that pertains to transparency. You know what, I should tell you also that the forthcoming rankings on data sharing and clinical trial transparency include all size companies now, and biologics, not just drugs. So you'll see these 42 companies ranked within the next couple of days. Also, what we did is we looked at, you know, were there any differences between how large companies and non-large companies were scoring? And here you can see that large companies have an overall higher median transparency score than non-large. Large companies' median transparency score is 96% compared to only 59% for non-large companies. And you have a p-value there of less than 0.001. And that is driven largely by large companies being much better at complying with FDAA, so U.S. legal registration results reporting, and data sharing. Just background, we're partnering with Scientific American to publish the rankings to elevate visibility. The more eyeballs on the rankings, the more incentive there is for companies to change and improve things. So we're excited about that. So now as I mentioned, we're expanding the measures to look at equity in biomedical research, equity domestically and globally. But the piece that's relevant for today's talk is we actually are looking at the availability of demographic data for pre-marketing and post-marketing studies supporting novel drugs approved by the FDA. And here on the screen, you can see just our preliminary look at novel cancer drug approvals between 2012 and 2016. And what you see is a lot of companies are not disclosing the demographics of the participants enrolled in their trials. And these are mostly pivotal trials. And so what you can see is only 48% of pre-marketing studies have public ethnicity data. And if you look at post-marketing studies, that percent plummets to 30%. You know, only 1 in 4 pre-market studies have public information about the age of participants. And anyway, you can see the numbers. And so this is the next area of clinical trial transparency that we're going to be adding to the scorecard. That's it. There's a lot of people involved in this project, all of which are much more capable and smarter than me. And I'm really grateful for them supporting and lending their talents, and to you guys again for inviting me to participate in this panel. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Miller. So our final speaker today is Dr. Kim Boesen, who's joining us from Berlin.
Yes, let me see here. So you should see my slides now, right?
Yes, that's fine. Yes, that's great.
Perfect. So first of all, thank you for inviting me and for letting me participate in this interesting seminar. Then I will be giving a European and European Medicines Agency perspective on this topic. So first of all, I have no financial conflicts of interest. Yeah, so already now we've had some areas covered related to this regulatory transparency. I will briefly be talking about decision making, access to data from authorized drugs, and guideline and committee member compositions and the conflicts of interest. But I mean, there are also many other issues related to, you know, staff management, price setting, patents, advertising, and trial regulation, but I will not be covering that. So in Europe, we have the European Medicines Agency, which is the European Union centralized body for approving and authorizing drugs. EMA was established in 1995. It has its headquarters in Amsterdam and is led by EMA Cook from Ireland. The revenue or budget for 2021 is estimated to 385 million euros, of which 86% comes from regulatory services and fees. So that is when a company, they want to have a drug approved, they pay for the assessment, they pay for the authorization, and that is the main body of income. And only 14% comes from central funding from the EU. Transparency seems to be kind of a pillar in the EMA organization. They have a large section on the website describing what kind of initiatives they have taken to increase transparency, and there certainly have been improvements over the time. So in contrast to what Joel Lexchin said about Canada Health, I would say that at least there have been some improvements in terms for the better when it comes to Europe. But in Europe, the situation is a bit murky because we also have each national country have their own drug regulatory agency, which is called a national competent authority. So we have, these are just a few of them. We have one in Sweden, one in Denmark, in Germany, the Netherlands, France, etc., etc. And they are all covered, united within an umbrella network called the Heads of Medicines Agencies. And that kind of creates a quite tricky situation sometimes when it comes to transparency. Because we have two major pathways of drug authorization in Europe. We have the central route, where the European Medicines Agency, they approve a drug and they make the drug available in the whole of the Union. And we also have the national routes, where either a single country or multiple countries, they assess and approve a drug, and then the drug will only be available in those or that country only. When EMA, they approve a drug, they do it under the EU Clinical Trial Directive from 2001 and subsequent regulations. The EMA, they have on top of that imposed their own transparency policies. We'll get back to them. And for all published drugs, they will publish, for all approved drugs, they will publish a public assessment report, which is a standardized format for making available a summary of why they approved the drug. In contrast, every drug approved through the national routes, they have to be and lie under the national legislations, and that means there are no harmonized rules regarding access to data, and no harmonized format for example, public assessment reports. Briefly about the public assessment reports, they contain a summary of the scientific discussions, of the clinical data underlying the authorization, and of the risk management plan. So that is, for instance, what kind of post-marketing studies are required by the regulator. It's a fairly it's a structured, standardized format, and it contains quite a lot of information. But there are also limitations to them. First of all, it's not exhaustive, so it doesn't report on all trials and all outcomes underlying the approval. And the scientific discussions might be insufficient. I will give you an example of that. And compared to other agencies, such as the FDA, which they publish the drug approval packages, they are substantially more extensive. But FDA will actually phase out these drug approval packages very soon. So the format we have in Europe might be the better of them soon. Just a small example, I've written a case about aripiprazole, which is an antipsychotic used for schizophrenia. And I went through the public assessment report published by EMA. And in this public assessment report, it doesn't appear that the primary outcome was switched midway through the trial. And it was switched in agreement between the regulator EMA and the company, because if they didn't switch the primary outcome, the trial would fail. And that obviously had a major impact on the decision making and on the final authorization. I only found out about this because I juxtaposed the Australian public assessment report, and in that report, it contained a much more lengthy scientific discussion. So obviously, this is just one example, but it's an example highlighting that even though these assessment reports might contain a lot of information, sometimes very essential and crucial information is not contained in these documents. Then EMA, they have some transparency policies, and that means that they have they practice a high level of transparency in terms of access to clinical study reports. And Lexchin already mentioned that Canada Health share clinical study reports, and the same does the European Medicines Agency. So briefly for those who are not familiar with them, the clinical study reports are part of the marketing authorization, and they contain all the clinical trial data that the company has submitted to the regulator. And they contain more complete and exhaustive trial data compared to journal publications and trial registries. So they have slowly become the gold standard for making drug assessments and evidence synthesis and systematic reviews. So if we ought to make the most reliable assessments, we should base them on the clinical study reports. So Health Canada, they share also clinical study reports, but the FDA, they do not share these documents. EMA, they introduced in 2010 policy 43, where they granted a retroactive access to clinical study reports of drugs that have been approved by the agency. And this came across after my colleagues at the Nordic Cochrane Center, they asked the EMA for access to data, and the EMA, they denied access. Then my colleagues at the Nordic Cochrane Center, former colleagues, involved the European Ombudsman, and the European Ombudsman engaged and agreed and said that the EMA should share the data. And they did so because they considered that the clinical study reports are not to be considered commercial confidential information. And that eventually led the EMA to change its practice by introducing this policy. Then 6 years later, in 2016, they introduced policy 070, which meant that they prospectively started releasing clinical study reports of centralized authorized drugs. Unfortunately, this policy has been paused because EMA has relocated after Brexit to Amsterdam, but it meant that all new drugs within 30 days, the clinical study reports were made available on a designated website. When it comes to the national competent authorities, so that is the national drug regulators in the European countries, there is a various degree of access to data because they govern and practice according to their own national legislation. So some national competent authorities will grant access to data and some do not. And I have been rejected access to data related to a project on the ADHD drugs, and a former colleague of mine were denied access to data related to statins. And that led us to send an open letter to the Heads of Medicines Agency just here in May 2021, where we asked the Heads of Medicines Agency to clarify the legal status of clinical study reports in the Union. We want them to highlight conflicting national legislations, and hopefully this will generate a national political interest. So naturally, the regulators will start sharing clinical study reports in a harmonized fashion. Then I will just briefly talk about EMA and committee members, because EMA, they publish something called Clinical Efficacy and Safety Guidelines. So this is basically cookbooks on how to design and conduct pivotal trials within a certain area. So for instance, within psychiatry, within cardiology, they publish a guideline describing how should the trial be designed, what should they report, how should it be reported, what kind of population are we talking about, etc., etc. So I looked at a sample of psychiatric guidelines, and it turns out that the EMA are not publicly disclosing the EMA committee members. We submitted Freedom of Information Act requests, and here a year and a half later, we still have not received an answer to that. They do, however, disclose stakeholders who comment on these guidelines. So people or organizations who comment on draft versions, concept papers, and the final papers. And we found that 2/3 were from industry, a quarter came not from industry, but they had conflicts of interest, and the last 10% were independent. And then in EU, we have a very exciting thing coming up. We have the EU clinical trial regulation. It was passed already in 2014, and it is expected to be applied in next year, beginning of next year. And it's been delayed quite extensively because of the technical problems with the platform that has to be used, the Clinical Trial Information System, CTIS. In this regulation, it says quite clearly that clinical study reports must be shared for trials intended for marketing purposes. So there's an emphasis on transparency and uniform reporting across the Union. And because it's a regulation, it means that all member states must adhere to it, which is quite good news. So just to summarize what I've been talking about. So the EMA, they exhibit quite a high level of transparency regarding access to data. I've called it a moderate level. We can discuss this about transparency related to decisions reported in the public assessment reports, at least a room for improvement, and a low level of transparency regarding guideline committee members, at least the ones we've been looking at. When it comes to the national competent authorities, there's a various level of transparency because there are no harmonized standards. Hopefully, the EU clinical trial regulation will standardize some of these issues. But still, we have important political actions that needs to be taken in the individual member states. So what can be improved? I mean, there are many issues that can be improved. These are just some of my ideas. I mean, first of all, we need a better overview of what trials are included in marketing authorization applications, and that goes across all documents that EMA and the other regulators make available. We need better reporting, as Joel Lexchin also talked about. We need better reporting on the scientific rationale in public assessment reports, especially. More transparency related to rejected applications. In Europe, because we have this structure of the EMA and the national regulators, it would be very, very nice with a common database on authorized drugs in Europe and the evidence base for each drug. For instance, in the US, you have the drugs at FDA, and because FDA is the only regulator in the US, then it's very easy to get an overview of what is actually approved. It's not the case in Europe. And then finally, we need, or it would be nice with better access to clinical study reports across the national drug regulatory agencies. So I think that was it, and thank you for attention, and looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Boesen. I'll just stop the recording.